that we had the time. I'm sorry that part was missed.
Nope. No worries. We will roll with it.
All right. Okay. So I guess we can, oh, you're controlling slides. So we can go ahead and just, so this is neuro-influencing compounds within foods. And just, and again, as I said, we always do this as a bit of an open forum. So I'm not I'm just looking at the slide portion. So I don't have the chat section open. So Katie, if there's questions that come up or anybody raises their hands or something comes up in chat, then let's, or just unmute yourselves as she had said earlier, so that this way we can just have an active discussion about things and what's really important for you guys. So just basically in terms of the brain, you know, and this is just something, because this was a very good book that I enjoyed reading many years ago. So it's been updated over the years, but it's just it's a good basic nutrition information book, Real Food by Nina Plank. So, but nonetheless, I grabbed this information just to talk about really the complexity of the brain, and it is really very high in fats, which is why we tend to focus a lot on the EPA, DHA components of omega-3s. So we can move right through this. Katie, you can go on to the next slide. And this was just also from another, you know, more recent references, both older and more recent references in terms of just why we are seeing so many neurological issues. Because of course, while 8P is our primary reason for meeting, we also have to consider and think about why we are all seeing meteoric rises in various pediatric neurological conditions these last 30 years, as has been documented. So the thought is, of course, that we're not getting enough of these essential fatty acids in our diets in general, because we've moved away from, let's say, what would be considered more traditional foods. So this again brings us back to the topic we've had all throughout about just wholesome, healthy, real foods, because every time we're having a processed, adulterated food, it's pushing out something that we could be eating that would be a real food that would be really providing our bodies and our cells tremendous benefit beyond just the vitamins and minerals we're all familiar with. So there's a lot in terms of documentation, in terms of how our diets have switched over these last few decades as we've moved toward more processed foods. Of course, now trans fats seem to be a thing of the past, but they were so prevalent. Hydrogenated vegetable oils were so prevalent in our diets through almost every type of food consumed that was processed in any way. And while they were eliminated because of the significant, data, proof that showed how devastating they were to the cardiovascular system, people are neglecting to remember that it's not just about the heart. The cardiovascular system involves the brain as well. So anytime all the mothers that grew up eating trans fats, and you know, my kids are well into their 30s, my oldest is close to 40, you know, these were when, you know, kids were having Ritz crackers and it was hydrogenated vegetable oil, you know, everything was hydrogen. Goldfish, like your pediatric diet, the conventional one was terrible, was so laden, right? So this is what so many kids from, you know, 30, 40 years ago until really just the last decade when trans fats were eliminated. But trans fats did two things. They not only were detrimental because they displaced, well, they were detrimental because of the plaque formation and the rigidity of the cell membranes. But they displaced the omega-3s, they displaced the good stuff. So even if you were getting some good stuff in your diet, the trans fats knocked it right out of the, it never really was able to get into our cells, right? So then So then, you know, as a population that was going on to procreate, we really didn't have the groundwork to set up an ideal neurological foundation for offspring. So we can go on to the next slide, but it's just sort of how everything sort of folds together and how we have gotten here. So to this place. So this just gives us a little bit more in terms of omega-3s versus omega-6s. There are some necessary and beneficial omega-6s, but the thing is that omega-6s get a bit of a bad rap because we wind up with too many of them again in our diet. And when we upset this ratio, we wind up getting more inflammation when there are more omega-6s to omega-3s. And this is also shown up in breast milk and the studies on breast milk, that breast milk can be highly inflammatory, again, because maternal diets could be very high in more omega-6s and lower in omega-3s. Next slide, please, because what this demonstrates is that you can eat in plant sources alpha-linolenic acid. It's a it's the one that the body can convert over to EPA and DHA, those two primary omega-3s that we're always talking about that are beneficial for the entire body and primarily for neurological development. But the body can convert very little of it. So you really have to eat an abundance of it. So this is just something that I focus on, especially with people who are vegetarians and vegans, which I totally respect. But we do have to make sure we close the gap to compensate with enough omega-3 source, either as a precursor or even the vegan sources of omega-3s, because you can produce DHA and EPA directly from algae. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this is all about, right, the neuroprotective therapeutic interventions of omega-3s. And again, you guys can read the slides. I put the slides and the references together just for further information for all of you. But I know I always have more than enough to cover in every discussion. So we'll just go through. This is just more information on omega-3s. Next slide. And the structure and function of them. So, and the next slide. Just more on the on this function. So the other point too, right, from how omega-3s help to reduce inflammation can also be looked at in terms of how well it helps maintain our blood sugar stability, because omega-3s, along with magnesium, which we talked about last time a lot, really helps the receptivity of the insulin glucose molecules through the cell membrane and into the cell as an energy source. So for anyone, we hear a lot about type 2 diabetes associated with obesity these days, and insulin resistance, meaning the body's making a whole lot of insulin in response to elevated blood sugar, but it's because the sugar isn't able to get into the cell with the insulin. It just bounces off. And so omega-3s and magnesium help facilitate that entrance into the cell, help our bodies utilize glucose more efficiently and utilize the insulin it's producing more efficiently, because insulin is a pro-inflammatory hormone. It's necessary for blood sugar maintenance and utilization, but if we produce too much of it, it's a fat storage hormone, but it's also a very high inflammatory hormone. And the goal is always to reduce body-wide inflammation, because the more inflamed our body is and the more inflamed our brain is, then the less likely we're going to be able to attend and focus and attain and maintain cognitive optimization. And this is why we don't always want a steady stream of just simple carbohydrates, even though they're easy to graze on and they seem easy to dissolve and, and ingest, because we can begin to break them down in the mouth with salivary amylase. So those carbohydrates break down and go down very easily. but we really have to make sure we're always getting enough good fats and high quality protein in the mix as well. Next slide, please, Katie. Thank you. All right, so as I mentioned too, this low omega-3, high omega-6, again, all in the literature, just how it winds up putting us more onto more inflammation, which is linked to all of these conditions. So we're going to make sure that never happens, because we want to be able to prevent what we can, what we do have control over. Next slide, please. This is just also a little bit more on also some other studies, just in terms of the N is for the omega-3 deficiency. And again, lots of studies on that too. We can really help modulate good behavior, so to speak, and mood regulation with an abundance of omega-3s. Next slide, please. And again, as we've said before, in many of these discussions, you know, depending on what your child eats and what your child may take supplementally, you have to discuss where to maybe fill in the gaps with a healthcare professional. This is just all offered as information, you know, just sort of a knowledge exchange. And we're all doing the best we can every single day to get in good nutrition, but this is just a little bit more of the science behind why. And again, just in terms of omega-3s, also the reason that it influences mood and behavior so much is because they are directly involved in the regulation of our neurotransmitters, between being happy and being attentive versus being irritable and cranky. Next slide, please. And I think I mentioned that a little bit in one of the previous discussions, even in terms of, you know, being a little more preparedness for puberty, because every time our bodies go through these greater growth spurts, we need more, there's more nutrient demand. And for puberty, a lot of these nutrients, especially the essential fatty acids, they get hijacked to go towards, and I use that term, so that's, and I've mentioned it before, because then they're going toward hormone production. And when they're going toward hormone production, there's a little bit less, they're being shuttled into the endocrine system. There's a little bit less available sometimes for the neurological system. And there are studies looking at that correlation when we look at the irritability and mood instability, emotional lability that occurs during puberty, and everyone blames it on the hormones. It's true, but when we dig in and do the deeper dive biochemically, it's because we really need to compensate with more of the omega-3s as well as other nutrients also. It's really a time for dietary optimization, so that all body systems are getting what they need. And unfortunately, sometimes by that point, food and dietary habits are a little more ingrained. And because kids on any level and during any growth phase tend to figure out that food is a way to also control a relationship with parental units, they are sometimes not always in their best place from an intake standpoint. As they are approaching puberty. So next slide, please. So just to kind of be prepared, and why it is important to like never give up in terms of trying to at least get all these nutrients either from food or supplementally when necessary, because as you know, kind of just to wrap up this section, the standard American diet, as I mentioned, even as from the breast milk standpoint, it's really high in the more inflammatory omega-6s than the non-inflammatory omega-6s and the omega-3s. So again, I'll bring it up. Next slide, please. Or maybe yes, so we're looking, as I mentioned, just good high quality food. So now the next slide, as has come up before, is really the Mediterranean diet, as we've talked about over and over again. So small amounts of lean, clean animal protein and fish, but really the abundance of nuts and seeds and olives and olive oil and vegetables. And vegetables and fruits, and not too much, right? So, of course, a lot of the kids do need additional calories from a growth standpoint. So that's why if we're looking at some dietary supplementation, we want to look at clean, organic, non-GMO nutrients with, or supplemental drinks and beverages, maybe a nice wholesome plant-based protein even. And this is, and there are different brands, and I'm not here to promote one thing over another, but certainly there are the more commercial, highly available brands that may be milk and corn syrup based for the purpose of getting calories in, and they'll talk about their protein level, and they'll talk about the vitamins and minerals. But when you really look at the ingredient list, it's super high in sugar and not really ideal forms of carbohydrate, in my opinion. Carbs that may be being drawn from genetically modified corn products and corn syrups. And so you just want to, even when you're looking to boost your child's calories, that it's coming from some of the more wholesome nutritional products that are made to add calories with a good balance of macronutrients and micronutrients coming from more ideal sources. Okay, next slide, please. So this, again, and we've talked about this when we talked about the gut. We spent a lot of time already on the probiotic scene, but it's, again, just to emphasize that a healthy gut microbiome is what is really connected to brain optimization as well, through a whole lot of various signaling mechanisms. So one of them that's been discussed in the literature, and I'm just looking ahead to, I think that there'll be a little bit more on this in the next slide. So certain carbohydrates can feed certain strains of non-beneficial bacteria in the gut, which may already be overgrowing. And those carbohydrates can be responsible for then producing certain organic acids. And one that's been studied is propionic acid. And while there may be a place for a certain amount of propionic acid in the body, excesses of it have been linked. And Katie, if you can go to the next slide, I'm thinking I might have a little bit more detail on. Oh, I don't. I'm sorry. If you can back it up, I'll just stay on propionic acid for a moment. I'm always deliberate. I have a lot in there, and then I clean out a lot. So I'm not just dumping so much info on you guys. But basically, you can look up this information too, and that was first done by Dr. McVabe. But in excess of propionic acid, can cross the blood-brain barrier and lead to more behavioral rigidity, more OCD and perseverative types of behaviors. These are in rat models, but even though this original one was published 10 years ago, there have been subsequent studies that have been published on the influence of excess carbohydrates feeding excess gut bacteria in the Clostridia family that wind up creating more propionic acid that can cross the blood-brain barrier and negatively influence mood and behavior. So there may be other propensities towards certain behaviors, but then the diet and what we're eating compounds it. So next slide, please. And part of that way that that communication is occurring is through the glial cells, the enteric ones, meaning the ones in the gut, and of course the ones that are in the brain. Next slide, please. You know how we probably all heard about, the gut is the second brain, and some people feel like it's the first brain. So next slide, please. Neurotransmitters in the gut, number 20. I wish I could control these. I'm sorry. I apologize. There we go. So And that's because the majority of our neurotransmitter receptors are in our gastrointestinal tract. So this is why, again, when I've mentioned before, even if certain medications are needed to regulate brain function, in order to optimize the efficacy of that medication, we still need the fundamental nutritional foundation, because you cannot really regulate neurotransmitters without nutrition and nutrients. They are at the root and the heart of the production of these compounds. So we may be able to influence how these compounds regulate how much neurotransmitters stay between a synapse from, but those medications can only maintain so much serotonin in that synapse based on how much serotonin the body is making itself. And it needs folate, and it needs vitamin D, and it needs essential fatty acids, and it needs certain proteins or amino acids in order to really make that serotonin. And all of that is produced in the gastrointestinal tract. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit more in terms of some of the studies of the gut brain connection. But let's see where we are just in terms of our time. So just being mindful of that. So, all right. And again, a lot more in the literature on that, and any of these subjects we can do a much deeper dive during our Q&A, which I believe is going to be, not certain yet, but maybe on August 8th during your conference day. Otherwise, we'll set up that time, and you can send questions in ahead, even that might occur to you as you go through these past few times that we've had together. Okay, next slide, please. Because as I said, AP is the primary diagnosis, but then unfortunately it doesn't, it doesn't create any immunity outside of all of these other conditions. So we really want to make sure that we're addressing total health. So one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of just the nuances of how certain foods can really influence our cognition and our behaviors. So many pesticides have been demonstrated to be neuroexcitatory, right? So, and these are just some of the, just some references. And so hopefully everyone is aware of, with the next slide, ways to keep our total pesticide level down. So the Environmental Working Group, or EWG.org, I think I've mentioned them before. They always update it every year or every other year. So this was the latest version, the 2019 shopping guide of the Dirty Dozen, the produce that is most impacted with pesticides. And it's not just on the outside. You have to realize it's in the soil, and they're added during every aspect of the growth phase. So it actually grows into the plant. It's not just a matter of washing the outside of it off. And so you can see the list of the foods that ideally should be purchased organic in order to keep our pesticide level down. And then the Clean 15, those that can be purchased conventionally, where you don't have to spend your food dollars on organic, which is going to run a little more expensive generally. So, and if something's labeled organic, it is non-GMO. So, however, non-GMO is not always organic, but organic's always non-GMO. And the thing is that pesticides we can clear from the body. So studies have been done checking the urinary excretion of pesticides, so with families too that have signed up for some of these more recent studies that have been done out of major universities. And within 1 week, and then even certainly by 2 weeks, switching over to all organic, there are less pesticides to no pesticides being excreted. So that's a pretty powerful thing. And again, it's because it's about that total load. If our body's really busy trying to eliminate these various exogenous or environmental toxins getting into our bodies from our food supply, then it has to work even harder and need even more good nutrients to detoxify and eliminate the waste that's produced within our body just from cellular turnover and energy production, right? So as I've mentioned before, always looking to lower the body burden and replete with enough good nutrients on hand. So the body can always do what it needs to do to be optimal and prevent other diseases from occurring. Next slide, please. Okay, so and then just sort of staying along the line of neuroexcitation. So this was a study from at least the 21st century in 2007 that actually proposed the mechanism of action as to why certain food additives do create hyperactivity. So artificial colors definitely came up, and sodium benzoate, or even any of the benzoate-based preservatives, as you might see, like BHA and BHT. A lot of those are in the boxes of cereals, conventional cereals as preservatives. You can go to the next slide. And what we're really talking about here is while phenols can be beneficial components, because phenols within foods are also antioxidants, but some of them can be a little more neuroexcitatory for individuals. And I'll get to that mechanism of action in a second. But the artificially prepared ones are a little more concentrated, and that's part of the problem. So it's kind of like if a child had a bag of Skittles, let's say. I know that would be a horrendous choking hazard for most kids with 8P, but it just comes to mind. And again, I'm mentioning brands, so I'm sorry, but you just as a visual, all those intense artificial colors, the same thing with the ones on conventional M&Ms, that all those intense artificial colors, even though there have been studies that have been able to prove that sugar in and of itself doesn't necessarily cause hyperactivity. Most of the issues are that the sugary candies, what may be causing the hyperactivity is actually these artificial colors. And many of them also have preservatives in them as well. Next slide, please. Is that in order to break down those chemicals in the body, the same enzyme that is used to detoxify or break down those artificial colors for the body to eliminate is the same enzyme pathway that's used to, you can go to the next slide, please. It's the same enzyme pathway that the body also uses to eliminate our excitatory neurotransmitters, because there's always this balance between inhibitory and excitatory, right? Inhibition and excitation. And there's that balance that we should be able to regulate naturally, but there's so much going on in the background to make that a natural occurrence. So, and when we're jamming up the pathway that should be being used to eliminate some of our more excitatory neurotransmitters, which can occur just because something catches our attention, right? This is the whole idea about excess sensory input, and even for children with autism, which of course autistic-like characteristics can happen secondarily to an 8P diagnosis. So when there's all that sensory input and our brain immediately is jumping up with a little bit more excitation, in order to right itself or level itself, that all has to come down. But it can't come down if you're kind of full of all these artificial ingredients that the body's trying to eliminate, because they're going to go out before the excitatory neurotransmitters go out. So that's basic explanation of that mechanism of action. So this is why, and you can go to the next slide, some people, for kids with ADHD and sensory integration issues and all, have followed from so long ago the Feingold diet, right? Because Dr. Feingold, Benjamin, I believe, Feingold had come up with this theory from years ago, long before the mechanism of action was understood. So, so the goal is to avoid foods that are higher in these particular phenolics like salicylates. And you can move over to the next slide, please. So the reason I put this up, when you look at like something, conventional beverages, like a child who might be having Sunny Delight for breakfast, followed by the next slide, I think is my slide on Mountain Dew. And so when you look at just some of these chemical ingredients in beverages that wind up integrating themselves into our diets as like, okay, or every once in a while, but you can see that just the cumulative, I think Mountain Dew, by now I have to update this slide, I think they've changed their sugar source, but even still, it's still got the benzoate and the artificial colors. So you can see the pile-on that can occur easily. So next slide, please. So what can we do about this, right? So so we want to look at maintaining all the healthy foods, as I've talked about. I do want to get into just other excitatory components, and that's coming up in terms of high glutamate foods. And when it says excess calcium, right, we want to make sure, as we talked about last time, our kids are getting plenty of good dietary calcium, maybe anywhere from 800 to 1200, depending on where they are in their growth phase, milligrams of calcium daily. But it's the idea of excess that can be somewhat excitatory. Okay, and I already talked about the natural anti-inflammatories from the omega-3 sense. All right, next slide. Okay. This is just all more information to support everything that we've talked about already. But I'm going to talk about glutamate in greater detail in a little while. Okay, so glutamate, right, besides being in a natural, can show up naturally in foods, right, like just foods that are naturally high in it and they're listed there. Then there are also foods where it's added, MSG. But what is important to realize is that many times MSG is hidden in ingredients under the broad term of natural flavors. Because technically, since glutamate can occur naturally in foods, it can be extrapolated and used as a flavor enhancer. That's what it really does. It accentuates flavor. But because it's also an excitatory compound, it's what's linked to even that kind of gut-brain connection in terms of wanting to eat a lot. So not to disparage any particular brands, but just popular things that come to mind. Think of all the varieties of Doritos with all that coating on them, right? From a ranch or a barbecue or even the original one. That coating, when you look at that ingredient list, right? Because food, when you think about food, it should be like a single ingredient, like an apple. It's got apple. That's it. Or even when we've talked about, bread, and even whether it's a gluten-free bread or a regular bread, you want an organic flour base of some sort, and then really water, maybe a little salt and yeast, right? To make it, so 4 ingredients. But when you look at many of the processed foods, the ingredient lists are this long, and many of those ingredient lists, those weeds of all those excess ingredients, that's where we get tangled up and loaded on with all this additional body burden. But within there are a lot of various flavor enhancers. And so those flavor enhancers all include MSG. And it's the reason why you can't eat just one, right? Why you go through a bag, because the more that you eat, the more you will crave until that entire bag is finished. And then, of course, then they put everything now commercially into single ingredient bags, right? So that's just, that just gets a little challenging too, because people can just open up a whole bunch of 100-calorie snack bags and eat those. But the idea is it increases the craving because of that excitation, because of that igniting the glutamate in the brain. So that's just one example. And also heavy metals is noted on the bottom. And then there's been some discussion even in terms of various electromagnetic fields causing more brain excitation. So there's a whole gamut of excesses that we need to be mindful of, because this isn't designed to make you guys crazy about, now what do we eat? It's just information, and we'll go from there. Next slide, please. All right, so here again, I'm just trying to give you sort of the bad news with the good news. So we could go ahead and now just talk about healthier foods, cleaner foods, brain-rich foods, you know, walnuts, pumpkin seeds, organic salmon for the omega-3s, as well as some other nutrients that are beneficial. All of your fresh, organic, or frozen, even if it's more ideal, you know, fruits and vegetables. Berries are, there's a lot on the literature about berries and their good brain potential because of they're such a great source of antioxidants. Some berries, though, can be a little high in salicylates, not to get confusing, but they are. And so if your child finishes a whole bowl of organic blackberries and they seem to be a little excited, or their cheeks are flush, or their ears are red, then maybe they are having a sensitivity to too much of those good phenolic compounds in the berries, and you need to maybe monitor that or blend the berries with another fruit. So you just watch the total load. Eggs come up again, and they're and it's primarily the white is the protein, and the protein is great, but a lot of the nutrition is really in the yolk. Next slide, please. Just so much benefit there in terms of the omega-3s and the choline too, as a foundational building block for the brain. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of these nutrients, which we again have touched on in other lectures, these are all brain supportive and good neuroregulatory nutrients for consideration. The compound, you know, certain foods like the berries, for example, they are high in resveratrol, and they are high in a lot of these, they're sources of a lot of these nutrients. And that really is, can be wrapped up in another term, the ORAC value, which is in the next slide. And that really is the, yeah, perfect, thanks. And that is really that measurement of the antioxidants that are present in a particular food. So when we hear about the benefits of chocolate, right? So, you know, like dark chocolate. So you could see the cocoa powder there, and the berries, and then the different other fruits and vegetables that are concentrated sources that have good ORAC value, like the red grapes, which is the skin of that, which is what made wine popular in those studies for the resveratrol capacity. So, so that's just sort of how all of this comes together. Hopefully it's coming together. Is this making sense for you guys in terms of just the good rationale behind a good diet? Next slide, please. Any questions so far on any of this, or if it's making sense? Again, I can go over to where I could maybe see the the chat
There's
comment.
no comments in the chat, but if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you can unmute right now because we have, I know technically we have just another 13 minutes, but I really, I always am fine with going a little longer. So, so I just thought I'd take a pause because I've been talking for a lot. So nothing, any comments, even discussion? Okay. I'm hoping this is somewhat helpful. So this is from where I am sitting in the northeast part of the United States. So this is just the cross reactivity between foods and various seasonal allergies. So this is something that, depending on whatever part of the world you're in, you can probably get this information. Maybe even your local allergist would have this information available. Okay, great. Thank you, Rachel. I'm glad you're taking all the information in and finding it helpful. But so this is the idea that you may not necessarily have a particular allergy to, let's say, pears or peaches, but if you do have tree pollen allergy, when the tree pollens are high wherever you are, then you might get some reactivity if you eat a fresh pear or apple, because the body looks at some of the enzymes, which are proteins, in those fruits and reacts to it the way it would react to the tree pollen. So it's not just even all the tree fruits. There are other things that you might not even think are in that, like, you know, to have fennel or a parsnip, right? It's still gonna, or celery and carrots, right? You don't associate those with trees, but they are going to trigger that same reactivity. So if the tree pollen's super high and you're already reactive, and then you have a nice healthy snack of carrots and celery, and you suddenly are really stuffy and you're like, what's going on? That could be what threw you over the top. So this is where food does get complicated, because these are good, healthy foods, but at different times of the year, as well as in different combinations, and concentration, they can impact our body and our mood and our cognition and our, you know, I'm sure many times when we're all short of a word to grab or anything, you know, you have to look at it. Is my blood sugar going down? Did I eat something that, you know, gee, maybe just that sort of white bagel and cream cheese didn't really deliver enough brain power to me, to be on top of my game at a particular moment. Like, this is not to make anybody neurotic or crazy about it all. This is really just to begin to understand how food influences our brain. And I think many people we go through life and we think that outside of, as an adult, certainly outside of alcohol, which definitely can affect your brain, we don't really think about the influence of food on our brain. And even back to the allergy component, as you look at the cross reactivity of these foods with different seasonal allergies, histamines alone, and I have some of that in other further down, you know, slides, but histamines alone get metabolized as excitatory neurotransmitters. So, which is why, you know, antihistamines historically, before they started being able to create the ones that bypass the central nervous system, you know, would make us drowsy, like all those old-fashioned antihistamines. They knock you out, and some of them still do. So, next slide, please. Back to glutamate. So this is where, for these last remaining dozen slides and all, I just put some extra information to expand on that a little bit more, because, and a few of the other topics I'd already mentioned, because again, it comes down to sort of like, what is one person's health, or, you know, healthy option is another person's poison, kind of thing. And certainly we're aware of that when it does come to food allergies, right? There are foods that would otherwise be considered super healthy, nutrient dense foods that someone else could be anaphylactically reactive to. So getting back to the glutamate, and the reason that I bring up the glutamate, right? So there's just boiling it down, very simple, right? There's serotonin, which makes us happy and calm, and then dopamine, which makes us alert and attentive. And then there's GABA, which makes us like calm and even sleepy. And then there's glutamate, which is like makes us really excitatory. Sorry, are you guys having trouble hearing me or seeing me? Katie, can you unmute? Is it coming through okay?
I can hear you okay. What seems broken, Jane?
I just want to make sure that, I know I have some storms rolling through the area, the remnants of
Kieran, can you hear us okay? Are you seeing this okay?
Yeah, I'm fine, Katie. Yeah, everything's going fine here.
Okay, great. Go ahead and keep going, Jerry. Thank you.
All right, so we've got the, sort of just in terms of how there's balance, right? Serotonin and dopamine and GABA and glutamate. So the glutamate issue comes up a lot because there's the benefit of bone broth, right? But the longer you cook a broth, the more natural glutamate is produced. That's why it's so savory, right? This is, as it's mentioned here, this is that umami taste, that real savoriness. And that's why it gets added to foods as a flavor enhancer. And any of the aged foods like a Parmesan cheese, and it's got all that savoriness to it. That's that glutamate component. But there's good and there's the bad flip side of it. Next slide, please. So it's again, when there are some people who have real sensitivities to it. And that's been long established in the literature, but this is, these are some more references, recent references. And the thing is that we've got the migraine component for anyone who's a migraine sufferer. And again, if your child is not verbal and you don't know sometimes when there's just crying or upsetness, and if headaches are ever thought to be part of it, you can just start to examine the foods that are going in. And then the next slide, Katie, thanks. And then what's really coming out on the other side. So anyway, these are just, again, some of the foods that are more likely to contain higher amounts of glutamate, even though they're found in a lot of just good, healthy foods, but in lower concentrations. Like you'd have to eat like a whole lot of mushrooms, and you might have to eat like the mushrooms, broccoli, and peas all together, right? We talked about the benefit of eggs, but, and the benefits of walnut for brain food, but it's really for those foods, you have to have a real concentration. So that's why it's when it's really concentrated as a flavoring agent or added to something, or if it's like in a, usually I would say for bone broths, if you wanted to make one and you were concerned about glutamate levels, I would say just really go with 12 hours. But when you get to 14 hours or longer hour cooking, like that's really gonna concentrate it. And that's why it's even recommended to have just small amounts, right, of it when you've got really long cooked bone broth. Next slide, because this gets back over to the histamine component that I had mentioned before too. So because this is the same thing, a lot of these foods, these aged foods, like the cheeses and the wines and the soy sauce, which are also high in glutamate, they're also high in histamines. So again, we don't know sometimes what anyone is reacting to. Is it a glutamate component or is it a histamine component? But you just want to begin to look at things like even the flushing reactions that occur for some people with drinking any, like a deep grape or a bone broth, or for adults with wine for your own self-examination. If it's the flushing, sometimes you think, is it the sulfites? Is it the glutamates? Is it the histamines? Or is it a combination of all of that? And it could even be representative of the load that you've had before. Because if your body's still busy trying to eliminate excess toxins from maybe poor eating a day or two before, then it's going to have a harder time by the third day when you're heaping all of this on. And so that's where always that concept of corrective compensation. If you have to do a grab and go for a particular meal on a particular day, just try to balance it out later on in that day so that the load doesn't get too high at any one point. Next slide. A little bit more on histamines. And there are low histamine diets available. There are lists of high histamine foods, and I can even provide that. I don't think I didn't include it here because I have a download of a low histamine diet, so you guys can just email me. That's easy enough for me to get to you. I know some of you guys have emailed me with some questions, and some are just a little longer or more involved than I've had a moment to respond to with as much detail as warranted. But something like the low histamine diet, I can easily send you that, and also a list of high salicylate foods, which is coming up next in the and this again is just a little bit more details on the positive versus negative effect of these foods, because it salicylates, as the name implies. I think everyone, maybe everyone, could think of the acetylsalicylic acid, otherwise known as aspirin, right? So aspirin could have great anti-inflammatory effects, but for others, it can create more excitation because it's just hard for the body to eliminate it. Next slide, please. Okay, this just again gives more examples of the different foods that are found in it, that it's found in. But I have actually a handout that, if you're interested, that breaks them down from the most concentrated foods that are high in salicylates to the lesser concentrated. Next slide, please. I think it's just more on salicylates. Sorry. Okay. All right, so a little bit more on the milk. I think I talked about this in the past too. And while the A2 milk is better tolerated as a protein, generally speaking, from a gut standpoint. Oh, and I think what I missed putting in this. Yeah, what I wanted to focus on here is that actually the A1 milk has been found to trigger more of the opioid receptors in the brain. So a little bit of kind of like a food fog, so to speak, that after drinking conventional A1 milk, besides some of the gut symptoms that can manifest, there can also be a little bit of a brain manifestation with the A1 milk, because certain foods and even gluten can create, again, in certain individuals, there can be more of the A1 milk and the gluten opioid activation in the brain, which kind of can make some people very addicted to those foods. So, and it can be tested out, but the best thing to do is just really do the elimination, is the easiest thing, and see if any of the symptoms change in terms of a brain fog or a clarity for your child or yourself. because it's also this opioid component that makes a lot of people constantly crave these foods. So for the kids that I see that are really preferential to just wanting to drink milk and, milk, downing lots of milk and like just eating a lot of like bread and bagels and crackers, that might really signal more of that opioid connection. Next slide. I think now I'm just going to be wrapping this up. This is just more on how, again, some very healthy foods are most often linked to high allergies. And allergies are sometimes when they're not just when the IgE component isn't just measured in the blood, the eosinophil level can be measured in the blood. Because eosinophils are a type of white blood cell the body creates in response to an allergic reaction. But we can also produce a lot of eosinophils in our gut in response to foods, basically looking to block food from getting further absorbed. So a lot of the just reflux or feeling like food is getting stuck because there's really just too many white blood cells coating the esophagus. So all of this is tantamount to a diagnosis called eosinophilic esophagitis. So I think I have that in the last couple of slides now. Katie, the next slide. And this is something that, when food is either eliminated or not eliminated, when kids are really rejecting food or having a difficult time swallowing, or there's an intense amount of reflux, then sometimes an endoscopy is done and they'll actually be able to measure the amount of eosinophils or these white blood cells in the esophagus and in the stomach. And then an elimination diet is recommended. I think it's in the last slide, but there are 6 foods that are highly associated with eosinophilic esophagitis, and that includes, again, the milk, wheat, corn, soy, eggs, fish and shellfish, I think. Hang on. Oh, it's right there. No, dairy, eggs, peanuts, and tree nuts, sorry. What I just named before were the common high allergen foods, but not necessarily the ones that are associated with EOE. EOE is limited to dairy, eggs, peanuts and tree nuts, seafoods, fish and shellfish, soy and wheat products. So there is an overlap. Corn isn't part of EOE. Corn is a high allergen for many, but it's not part of EOE. So again, foods that might otherwise be considered nutritious, right? Because again, we talked about the omega-3 sources coming from, fish, fatty fish, wild salmon, sardines being such a good primary source of omega-3s. But if you are prone to allergies and eosinophilic esophagitis, they would have to be out. But then we'd want to make sure that we gave your child an algae-based omega-3 to compensate, because of course, even trying to give them some of the precursors of the plant-based omegas from nuts and seeds would also be out because of the elimination of the peanuts and the tree nuts. The way that they do this is they really do a full elimination depending on how significant the EOE is. And then I know it's a lot of invasiveness because they'll often add back in one food alone and then repeat the endoscopy and measure the eosinophilic response, so that over time they can really identify which specific triggers there were for that particular person. So, and this is a condition that unfortunately also seems to be rising, and maybe just all part of a dysregulated immune system where we have this hyperreactive immune response, which we talked about last time as well. So anyway, that will, I think that's the last one. That will conclude everything that I wanted to share with regard to the complexity of the neurological compounds within foods that can either benefit us or for some individuals trigger us. So any questions? we're just a little after, I got 12:07, so we're just a little beyond an hour, but I do have time if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, anything that comes to mind that you'd like addressed that hasn't been addressed so far, now this is the 4th of our series, please email either Katie or myself or Bina. I'm glad you found that informative. Let me open up the chat here. I can only see the first part of the messages. Great, thank you. So it's just, it brings a whole new level of respect to food and what we're putting in our body beyond just like eat your vegetables because they're good for you. So that's always my goal, is to really educate everyone to the best of my ability. And hopefully with that education, you're motivated. Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. All right. Well then, Katie, are you there? Should we?
I am here. We should be good. I don't think there's any questions. So thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank
We
you
appreciate it.
guys. Have a wonderful day and weekend, and stay safe, everyone, and be well until I see you all again. I think we have, the one more that I think is going to be on the 8th of August, but if not, we'll get it scheduled.
Yep, I think we're going to get that set up to kind of do a Q&A on the 8th during AP day. So that should work out good for everyone.
Any particular topic, if you want me to go back to the sleep component and the interaction of food and sleep, and and here, for example, like if you give some bone broth to your child at bedtime thinking it's going to be good to coat their little bellies, which it could be helpful, but then if they have a hard time winding down, maybe it is the glutamate component. So again, ideally everything that we've talked about will find a purpose in your application at home within your own families. And if not, if there's something you really want me to focus on, just send that information along and I'd be happy to next time we're together. Okay.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, guys. Bye.